Hello, everyone. Let's talk a little bit about how you actually go about starting the research now that you've had your research idea either approved or have talked to me about how to clarify your topic. This is how to actually then do the research. So let's talk a little bit about methods and procedures of historical research. I like to kick this off with an analogy. Maybe it's a metaphor. I don't know. I never learned the difference between those two things. Uh, some of the more traditional styles of research, some of the more different styles of research that you'll find in other classes, like the content analysis that you might perform in mass communication theories, or if you're a PR student and you learn how to do some of the survey-based research that goes along with public relations. That stuff tends to be, like the whole idea of how we build the study, tends to be more like a baking recipe, like how to put together a loaf of bread. The instructions are going to be very specific. You need to measure everything out precisely how it needs to be done. You can't fudge and add just like a half cup extra flour because you feel like it. It'll mess the whole thing up. Everything's got to be incredibly precise and has got to be one thing, then another, then another, then another. And it has to be very linear in order to make the loaf of bread come out correct. That's like all the other research in other courses. History research is a little bit different. It's sort of like making a good pot of chili. You might have a recipe for a pot of chili, but if you happen to have, let's say, more beans than it calls for, you can just toss the beans in. It'll be fine. It might make for a better chili. You can experiment, right? You can add in some onions. You can add in some bell peppers if you want to. You can throw some tomato paste in there. I've even made chili before that had Dr. Pepper in it. That was very good. Strange, but good. Writing history and researching history is a lot more like making a pot of chili than it is like baking a loaf of bread. It's a little bit here and there. It's deciding how you want to describe your historical narratives. It's deciding how the certain angle you're taking and describing how this one thing was covered from different angles, how that analysis can be best portrayed. It could be looking at maybe common sources or common themes or common narratives. We're going to talk about these things. But the idea is that when you're working on this historical research, don't feel like it has to be this very instructional linear thing. Historical research is about conveying a historical story. And so it's not as rigid, which a lot of people really like and helps them do it. Okay, so what exactly do historians do when they are performing historical research? They're attempting to answer the question, why? Why does this matter? Why did this happen? Why did the press cover it this way? You're not just describing what happened, you're trying to answer why it happened that way that it did. You're seeking to capture and relate the thoughts and feelings of a past time. That's something that I also want to convey as well. It's not just dates and places. History is not just on this date, this newspaper ran this, on this date, they ran this, on this date, they ran this. It's about why was it done that way and what were people thinking? What did the audience think? How did they feel? How did this impact people's feelings? How did this change people's thoughts and feelings in the society in which this was published or in which it was happening? Whether it's a film or a song or a newspaper coverage of something, it's about capturing thoughts and feelings, which is a hard thing to research, but I'll show you how to do it. History attempts to be informative about human behavior, about how people have related to one another, and about how they have interacted with the conditions of their time. That's another thing to keep in mind with history writing and historical writing. You have to keep in mind that all of the actors involved here, right? All of the newspaper reporters, the newspaper publishers, and the film directors and film producers, right? Any of the people and actions that they performed that are a part of your historical analysis existed in the conditions of their time, right? They were existent in the cultural norms and the other thoughts and feelings that people had in that period of time. And the purpose of history is to provide reasonable explanations for the complexity of evidence for some parts of the past. You are trying to provide explanation. You're trying to explain to people that not just that this happened, but here is a way that you can understand why it happened. It is the process behind these things happening. So the goal of a historian, if we could just sum it up really roughly, is to reconstruct the past as accurately as possible. And to sort of connect it back to the last slide, it is to do it in a way that helps explain. So let's talk a little bit about the method of this. How do you perform a good historical analysis? First of all, we have to talk about the different kinds of sources that exist in historical analysis. Historical analysis is based around what we call two different kinds of sources. One is a primary source, and the other is a secondary source. A primary source are the main folks involved with what you are researching. So if it is an event itself, it could be, or it's the most true form, right? So if it is an event, it would be a recording of the event, like someone took a camera and filmed it, would be a primary source. If it's an experiment, it would be personal observations and artifacts, the actual notes of the people performing the experiments. If it's a television program, it could be the annotated director's script. But it is the stuff that was primary. It is the stuff that was the first draft. It is the as close to tangible interaction with the people themselves as we can get. Now, for some of the research that we're doing, you're doing in this class, you might actually have some living primary sources you can get in contact with. I don't mandate that you do because this is a short semester, but a lot of the times, like for me in my research that happens to do with how the news covered NASA, my primary sources are both the reporters who were actually out there covering NASA in the 60s and 70s who are still alive, and the press agents, the people who worked for NASA in the public relations side of things and provided information to the reporters. And I was able to interview some of them, or I have talked to some of them in the past about this work. Secondary sources are still good and are still useful. They're just classified differently. A secondary source would be an edited recording describing events. It would be quoting observations of others. It would be if a television program, instead of it being the director's script notes about the program, it would be what a television critic thought about that television program. As long as you are able to conceptualize the differences between primary and secondary sources, then you should be good to go. And for those of you, a lot of you are doing journalistic style things for this. Not everybody, some people are doing movies. Weirdly, didn't have anybody doing music, but some people doing TV shows and movies. Most of you are doing journalistic stuff. The primary source, if we are studying journalism, is going to be those news articles, those television clips. It's going to be the actual journalistic product that was produced, because that's what we're studying. So for example, a fair number of you are looking at various aspects of how the press covered 9/11 and how the events of September 11th changed how news covered, for example, breaking news events, or covered terrorist attacks, or covered issues with the Middle East, sort of things that have popped up as topics that you all have pitched. In this case, we're not writing a history about the September 11th terrorist attacks. We're not writing a history of all of how the Middle East has had issues with international foreign relations with the United States. We're talking about, you're writing a history of the media coverage of these things, which means that the media products, those news articles, those magazine articles, those television clips, those are going to be your primary sources. And your secondary sources will be things like books that have been written about this topic already. So your goal is to read as much primary material as you can, and then supplement that with secondary material to help fill some of the gaps in your own knowledge in your paper. It helps you immerse yourself in the language, the tone, the sources, the people, the ideas, all of that contextual stuff we talked about that you're going to try to put in this paper to explain to somebody, here is how blank has interacted historically with blank. It helps give that context to the reader. Your goal is to look for common themes, narratives, connections. Look at way things were connected. Look for commonalities. Look for things that are missing. Think about what might be missing. And you need to answer the proposed question you based your research pitch around. You had to ask yourself a question to make the pitch possible. Your research paper works in service of answering that question. How did the events of September 11th impact how the United States media covered the Middle East? That's a question, right, that you're going to answer. For my own research, it is, how did the press cover the Project Gemini or Skylab, which were the two NASA projects I write about? So take notes while you're reading through your primary material as well. You should study this, right? This is not just reading it and trying to, churn it into something. Treat it almost like the textbook when you go to take a quiz or something. Like, make notes to yourself, find common themes, highlight stuff if you can print it off and highlight it. And so in order to do that, we're going to need to spend some time searching. And so let's talk about some of the ways we can search. And as a part of that, we will bring our friend the internet into it. Now, the first thing we can search is background material. Background material is stuff that's not really going to find its way in a cited format into your paper, but it's stuff that you can teach yourself to help better prepare yourself as you go looking for your primary and secondary sources. So what I mean by that is stuff like Wikipedia and YouTube explainer videos. Now, it might seem crazy that you have a professor telling you to read Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a wonderful resource. I don't think you should cite it in your overall papers. I don't think that's probably the right thing to do, but it's good at teaching yourself what you're writing about. So let's say, I'm brand new to writing about NASA, how the press covered NASA's project Skylab. I might read the Wikipedia article for Skylab. I'm not going to cite any of this stuff in the actual paper. I'm not going to say, like, according to Wikipedia, because that would be silly. But I can certainly learn a lot of background terminology from just reading this, right? I can look at what some of the planned goals were for the mission, that then once I know that, I can start looking for some of that stuff in the primary material, which would be the news articles. And so, like, if I want to know, for example, how many different missions there were to the Skylab space station, look, it'll lay it all out for me. I see that there was one unmanned mission, and then there were 3 manned missions. And this helps learn some of the terminology, because this is a very specific example for this paper, but I bet you have something like this too. If you look at the naming on this, the first manned Skylab mission was actually called Skylab 2 because they had to send the actual laboratory into space by itself first. So when you see press coverage that refers to these as different numbers, you can point that out. Hey, the press routinely called it the wrong name through its entire career. That's how little they cared about it. So that and explainer videos can be really useful too. Like, if you have no idea, I just added that to the queue. I wanted to just watch it outright. If I want to watch a quick video explaining some of the history of Skylab, that might actually help me out as well. Depends on what kind of learner you are. So that's where I think is a good starting spot. Stuff that you might not put in the paper, but stuff that might be useful in knowing the terminology and knowing some of that background info. And if you find anything cited on Wikipedia, you know how that works. You just find the stuff at the bottom of the page. It's where the authors of this article have cited it. Feel free to follow that and cite something from there. Just don't cite Wikipedia. You know that. They teach you that, I'm sure. Okay, next, now that you have armed yourself with the appropriate background knowledge, you're going to look for some primary sources. This is where you're going to look for newspaper, magazine, and web archives. This is where you're going to look for YouTube videos of television programs or movies if you are looking, or if you're researching that. This is where we are going to bring in our friend, the Georgia Southern Library. And the library down here is where you can find some of your most important databases. Now, if you feel totally stuck, this is a really good time to advertise this. If you feel absolutely, totally 100% stuck, you have no idea how to find some of the stuff that you need for your research that you're looking for, the library has a wonderful service called Ask a Librarian. All you got to do is toss in your name, your location, which is where you're studying. You are currently off campus. Or you could probably put states for a campus. I don't think it matters that much. And then ask your question, hey, where can I find a database of blank, right? And there's a live human being on the other end of this that will help you out, just not on Saturdays. I don't think they are, they have some hours on Sundays, but I don't know about the summertime. I know they are not answering on Saturdays. So the actual database section is what we want here. There's A to Z databases. Click that right there, including Galileo. Why it feels the need to say that, I don't know. And then we have all of our databases here. Now, let's say my research is looking at New York Times, and I want to type in, well, I'll take the caps lock off, New York Times, hit go. Hey, look at that. The New York Times Online Full Access for Georgia Southern students, faculty, and staff. I'm Georgia Southern faculty. You're Georgia Southern students. Some of you are Georgia Southern staff as well. We can click on this. Now, it will give you this warning that, like, hey, because of some stuff that's messed up, you can't access it this way. I think your accounts that already exist should work. If they don't, you can always just VLAB it and it'll work fine. But let's go then to the click login there. I've actually just already got it on another site. So I'm just going to go to the New York Times website, which if you have made your account, you can just do it that way, or you can log in via VLab and do it this way as well. And I'll use this little search arrow up here and I'll type in Skylab and I'll hit go. And what this will give me, this is an entire whole archive of everything the New York Times has ever written since the beginning of, I think their archive goes to the 1880s, I think, or 1890s. It's a very old archive. And I can change it up here from sort by relevance to sort by newest or oldest. In this case, I'm going to go oldest because I want to sort of see the older stuff. And then if you'll notice that the word Skylab was likely used back in the, it's really early 1860s, goodness gracious. And so we can actually then just change it to a date range and say specific dates. And I want to say everything from the year, let's see, 1960 to 1970. Actually, just change that to 1980. Let's go the 2 decades. Hit enter, and it then should, if I then refresh it, it should give me those correct things. It may actually just need a specific date range. Let's go 01/30/1960, and let's make this to 12/31/1980. And there we go. That'll limit it down, and we can see all of the articles involving Skylab. Now that means that I'm likely going to have to sort through some of these. I'm going to realize there's some of this stuff that's going to simply have the word Skylab that isn't about the space station. So I'm going to have to sort through them and read through them. That is one way of doing this. There are other, if we go back to the Georgia Southern Library website, and we change this from New York Times to just newspapers, we'll see that there's Georgia Historic Newspapers, Newspaper Source Plus, Bullitt County Newspapers. No one did anything local. I kind of wish someone did something at least a little local. That's okay. It's your decision. You get to pick what you think is interesting. ProQuest is a place that has tons of newspaper databases built within it. And there's also a New York Times database in ProQuest, but it just doesn't go back any further than the 1980s. International News Stream, Canadian News Stream, US News Stream from ProQuest, and then certain specific newspapers as well, like the Augusta Chronicle Archive from the 1790s until the 1930s or 1990s is here's 200 years of news out of Augusta, Georgia. That's really interesting. So there is tons of stuff here to find your primary sources. And then if you're doing anything television-based, YouTube is a pretty good source. And also Vanderbilt University, you might want to search for that. Vanderbilt University has an archive of television news, the nightly TV news, which is your big three, CBS, ABC, and NBC. And then last but certainly not least would be your secondary sources, right? So if you are, if you have read all the articles there are to read on the New York Times about the Project Skylab from NASA, but you feel like there's some stuff you still want to include in here, right? You want to see, has anybody written a history of Skylab, like a book or something that talks about press coverage? Well, that is where, again, we want to go back to our friend, the internet. And we can hop on stuff like Google Scholar is a good place for stuff like this. So this would be stuff like I could type in Skylab history and say, hey, look, someone has a book on this, Living and Working in Space, a history of Skylab. Homesteading Space, the Skylab story. I might want to look at these books, either through checking them out through a online library, if you have an in-person library that has them. Most libraries are opened up nowadays, even though we're all being very safe for coronavirus. And also you can, most of these books that are going to pop up here pretty old. You can find them for very, very, very cheap. So let's say I just want to check out homesteading space. I might want to scroll through this book and see, hey, does this book about the history of Skylab have anything, does it say anything about the history of the press coverage? Turns out it doesn't, which is why I wrote a piece of research that's just about the press coverage side, because no one's done it before. So this would be your secondary stuff, looking for books people have written about the topic. And places to look there would include Google Scholar, which I just showed you. You can just Google search Google Scholar, or it's scholar.google.com. The three big research databases that are available through the university that are very holistic are EBSCOhost, LexisNexis, and Galileo. You can look for books, articles, essays, anything through history is going to be in probably one of those three. And then just a good old-fashioned library, either the university's library, which has got lots of materials online, and you can check out your local library, or wherever your local library happens to be. I bet there's probably books, physical, actual books, about your topic there to some extent. So check out some books. So that's really it. That is the way to get going, right? Think about the three things you want to do now that you have your topic approved or clarified at least a little bit. You want to teach yourself as much as you can about the terminology of this topic. So either an explainer video or read Wikipedia about it. Yes, I am telling you to read Wikipedia, believe it or not. Two, you want to track down those primary sources. And if you are studying the history of mass communication, as we all are, that means we're talking about primary media products. Newspaper articles, magazine articles, television shows, etc., movies, songs, mass communication products. And then you want to round that out by finding those secondary sources, which will be books and other things that have been written about the topic, that you can then draw those connections to the primary sources themselves in order to answer the question and explain to somebody what in the world was going on historically in the world of mass communication involving your topic. So hopefully that gets things going in the right direction. Look for another video here soon that will be all about how to actually write history. So how things are phrased and formatted correctly. So I'm so darn excited to see your research as it is going to be due in a couple weeks now. All right, see you.